Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls, for when the lights go out. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all wrapped up and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Well, you are in for a treat tonight. We are on part 11 of George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl, and tonight's story is called Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. And tonight's story, shout out to Nigel, I think he's in France, for being a super duper person. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he'd put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do for the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, weaving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other side of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with cornflakes," cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is to make one more saucepan of that as a tester." "But Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put in the same stuff into the saucepan as you did yesterday. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anything except himself. And then, he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on Old Hen just to make absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build a giant factory." "But Dad—" "Come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You'll see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in it?" "I went up to the bathroom first," said George. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Cranky. "Up here we go. To the bathroom we go." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you've used. If anything is empty, it means you've used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then They went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set. Flowers of turnips, perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," said George. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I? I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness, what a mass of stuff you used," he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said. And he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on the list. Then he went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. "Now show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together." And that's the end of part 11 of George's Marvellous Medicine, Mr. Cranky's Great Idea, here on the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls for when the lights go out.